The night sky over the Atlantic was quiet at first, the kind of deep silence that pilots secretly cherish. Flight 237, a Boeing 787 bound for London, hummed gently as it sliced through the dark. Inside the cockpit, Captain Alyssa Hartman adjusted her headset, her eyes focused on the glowing flight instruments. She had done this countless times before, yet tonight, something inside her felt uneasy. The radar showed a faint green blur far ahead. "Looks like a cell forming," her co-pilot Mark Daniels muttered, sipping his coffee. Alyssa nodded. "Could be nothing, but let's keep an eye on it." Her voice was calm, that tone that everyone in the cockpit trusted, even when the unknown loomed ahead. Alyssa was known across the airline for her serenity in chaos. A decade ago, she'd once landed a plane after a lightning strike had crippled both engines, an event that still gave her crew goosebumps. But tonight wasn't just another flight. Tonight, the sky itself seemed restless. As the aircraft cruised at 36,000 feet, turbulence began to whisper through the fuselage, a gentle vibration that soon turned into a trembling hum. Passengers stirred, flight attendants paused mid-service, and a baby's soft cry echoed through the cabin. Alyssa tapped a few buttons, bringing the radar closer. The faint green was now a swirling red cluster. "Storm line stretching 50 miles ahead," Mark said, scanning the display. "Can we divert north?" she asked. "Negative. Air traffic says the northern corridor is full. We'd have to cut through the edge." Alyssa took a slow breath. "All right, then we prepare." Below them, thunder rolled through the darkness, unseen but deeply felt. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm, measured, reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're approaching an area of unstable weather, so please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Nothing to worry about, just a few bumps." But as the minutes passed, those few bumps became something far more menacing. The sky ahead lit up in violent bursts of lightning, illuminating vast walls of cloud like floating mountains. Rain pounded the windshield. The plane jolted, and the autopilot alarm sounded a sharp tone. Alyssa grabbed the controls. "I've got it," she said firmly. Mark's hands hovered over the instruments. "Wind shear warning!" "Hold her steady. Adjust pitch 2 degrees down," Alyssa commanded. Outside, nature was unleashing its fury. The plane rocked violently, trays crashed, and terrified gasps filled the cabin. In row 17, a little girl clutched her mother's hand, whispering, "Are we falling?" But in the cockpit, there was only controlled chaos. Every motion was deliberate. Every word mattered. "Speed 275 knots. Altitude holding at 35,800, Mark said. "Good. Keep it there. Let the storm pass us, not the other way around." Alyssa's mind raced, not with fear, but with precision. The air pressure dropped suddenly, and alarms filled the cockpit with shrill tones. "Cabin pressure fluctuating," Mark shouted. Alyssa switched to manual control. "Re-engage bleed air valve. Stabilize now." Lightning flashed across the nose of the plane, and for a moment, the cockpit was bathed in blinding white. The roar of the engines fought against the wind's howls. Alyssa's voice remained calm, almost unnaturally calm. Then a sudden jolt. The plane dipped sharply. Passengers screamed. The autopilot disengaged completely. "Manual! Manual control!" Mark yelled. "I have control!" Alyssa's hands gripped the yoke tightly as she fought the violent updrafts. Rain hammered the windshield. The storm wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. Wind shear from multiple directions threw the massive jet around like a paper toy. The instruments flickered, then went dark for a second. The worst second imaginable in aviation. Then power returned. But with it came a new horror. One of the engines had flamed out. "Engine 2 failure," Mark called. Alyssa didn't flinch. "Restart sequence now." He began the checklist. Fuel flow, ignition, N1 rotation, nothing. She kept the plane level, fighting the controls with every ounce of focus. "All right, then we fly her on one engine. Maintain 34,000 feet. Keep her nose stable." The turbulence worsened. It wasn't just a storm anymore. It was a battle, and at 34,000 feet, there was no room for fear, only control. Down in the cabin, flight attendants moved carefully, calming passengers, strapping themselves in between tremors. One of them, Sarah, whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for the woman flying them through this nightmare. Back in the cockpit, sweat dripped down Alyssa's temples, but her eyes were steel. "Tell ATC we're declaring emergency," she said, her voice steady as ever. "Flight 227, one engine out, severe turbulence. Request priority vector." Static crackled through the radio. The storm was interfering with communication, Mark repeated, louder. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. Flight 227 declaring emergency. One engine failure. Heavy turbulence. Requesting immediate descent clearance." No response. For a full 30 seconds, there was only static. Alyssa's heart beat slower, steadier than the storm outside. "We're not losing this one," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Finally, a faint voice broke through the static. "Flight 227. This is Gander Control. You are cleared to descend to 28,000 feet. Heading 094. You're not alone up there." Alyssa smiled faintly. "Copy that, Gander." "Appreciate the company." She lowered the nose gently, easing the plane into descent. The clouds outside seemed endless, dark, boiling, and alive. The passengers had no idea how close they were skating to disaster, but they could sense something was wrong. In row 5, an elderly man closed his eyes and whispered, "God bless whoever's flying this thing." The plane continued to shudder and creak. But Alyssa's hands never trembled. Her voice never cracked. Her calm, quiet, absolute, began to ripple through the crew. "Hydraulics holding steady," Mark said, glancing at her. "You're a rock, Captain," she smiled faintly. "Not a rock, just calm water in a storm." As the minutes crawled by, the radar began to show a thinning line, an opening. The worst of the storm was passing. "Looks like a break ahead," Mark said. "Then let's guide her home." Outside, lightning flickered one last time, not in defiance, but as if saluting the courage within that cockpit. For now, they were still airborne, still fighting, and because of one woman's calm, 185 souls still had a chance. The storm didn't care about courage. It didn't care about skill, experience, or calm voices. It roared and twisted through the sky, swallowing everything in its path, and Flight 227 was right in its jaws. Captain Alyssa Hartman held the yoke with a grip born from years of discipline. Her heartbeat was steady, her breathing controlled. She'd faced storms before, but not like this. The aircraft's right engine had failed completely, and every second felt heavier. "Altitude 32,000 and dropping," Mark reported, his tone tense. "Maintain descent rate. Keep it shallow. We need control, not speed," Alyssa replied. Outside, the world was chaos. Lightning carved jagged scars across the clouds. Thunder boomed like cannon fire, and rain smashed against the fuselage with relentless fury. Each gust of wind threatened to roll the aircraft. Inside the cabin, the scene was desperate. Overhead lights flickered, the emergency exit signs glowed red, and passengers held hands, whispering prayers. Flight attendant Sarah moved down the aisle, calm but pale. "Please remain seated, everyone. We are in communication with control," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. She wasn't sure if the passengers believed her, but she had to sound like Alyssa, calm, no matter what. Back in the cockpit, Alyssa's eyes darted between the instruments. The wind speed indicators jumped wildly. "We've got a crosswind shear, 25 degrees off," she said. Mark frowned. "That's throwing us toward the storm center. Then we fight the wind, not the storm. Recalculate heading 094. The plane lurched violently, the nose dipping. "Pulling up," Mark started, but Alyssa's voice cut through the alarms. "Easy. Don't fight the storm head-on. Ride with it. Feel its rhythm." Her calmness wasn't emotionless. It was focus turned into art. The Boeing groaned under stress, but Alyssa guided it as if it were alive, sensing its pain, steering it gently away from destruction. Then came the voice on the radio, faint, distant but human. "Flight 227, this is Gander Control, radar contact intermittent. We're tracking you. What's your situation?" Mark pressed the mic. "Gander, we've lost one engine, severe turbulence and unstable altitude. Attempting to clear storm line. A pause. Then, "Copy that, 227. You have open skies 30 miles east. Hold course, 30 miles. 30 miles of hell before peace." Alyssa exhaled slowly. "We can make it." The plane rolled again, hard. Oxygen masks dropped throughout the cabin with a hiss. Passengers screamed as trays and luggage crashed from the overhead bins. The entire aircraft rattled like it was being torn apart. "Structural stress warning," Mark shouted. "Stabilizers holding?" "Barely." "Then hold on," she whispered, tightening her grip. Her voice filled the cockpit again. "Engage hydraulic assist. Trim 2 degrees left. We're going to glide through the center pocket." Mark blinked. "The eye of the storm?" "Are you serious?" Alyssa's lips curved faintly. "It's the calmest part, if we time it right." She knew the risk. Entering the eye of the storm meant gambling everything. But the radar showed the path, a small hollow between 2 massive thunder cells. It was their only chance to regain altitude and stabilize before they lost more control. "On my mark," she said. 3, 2, 1. "Bank left!" The aircraft tilted, engines howling. Lightning flashed inches from the nose. The passengers felt it, a turn so sudden that hearts skipped. But Alyssa's hands were steady, eyes locked on the horizon. Through the chaos, they pierced the wall of clouds, and then suddenly, silence. The turbulence stopped. Rain vanished. They were inside the eye, a breathtaking, terrifying calm surrounded by towering clouds glowing faintly with lightning from within. Mark stared out the window in disbelief. "We actually did it," Alyssa smiled softly. "Told you, storms have rhythm. You just have to listen." For a moment, the world was still. Down below, the moonlight broke through, reflecting off the Atlantic like shattered glass. The passengers, still trembling, looked out the windows and gasped. They were flying through light and peace. Sarah peeked into the cockpit. "Captain, the passengers are terrified. Can I tell them we're clear?" Alyssa nodded. "Tell them we're stable, and that will be fine." As Sarah turned to leave, another alarm blared. Mark cursed under his breath. "Engine temperature's dropping. We've got ice buildup in the intake." Alyssa's moment of peace vanished. "Switch anti-ice on full. Increase fuel flow to stabilize heat." He flipped the switches. Still dropping. She bit her lip. "We can't afford to lose another engine. Divert bleed air from cabin. Give it all to the intake heaters." Mark hesitated. "That'll drop cabin pressure." "Do it," she ordered. The lights flickered again as systems rerouted power. The plane vibrated, then steadied, temperatures rising. "Ice melting," Mark said with relief. Alyssa exhaled. "Good. Now let's get out before the storm decides to close in again." The radar showed the eastern edge approaching fast, walls of turbulence moving back toward them. The eye was collapsing. They had only minutes. "Throttle up. 1 engine full, other assisting," she said. "We're climbing to 31,000. The 787 roared again, pushing forward through the last barrier of clouds. The turbulence returned, weaker but sharp. The nose bounced, then steadied. The cockpit glowed with the soft blue light of the instruments. And then, just like that, the darkness broke apart. They emerged into open sky. The stars shone above them, the storm fading behind like a defeated beast. Mark leaned back, drenched in sweat. "We're clear. We actually made it." Alyssa smiled faintly, staring at the horizon. "The storm always ends. It's just about how long you can stay calm enough to reach the light." Below, the Atlantic stretched endlessly, calm and glimmering. Behind them, the storm still raged, but its power was nothing compared to the strength of one human's will. In the cabin, the tension melted. Applause broke out, spontaneous, shaky, but real. People cried, hugged, laughed. They didn't know how close they had come to disaster. And they didn't need to. Because in that cockpit sat a woman who refused to break. The storm was finally behind them. But as Flight 227 leveled at 31,000 feet, Captain Alyssa Hartman knew the danger wasn't over. The storm might have spared them, but the aircraft hadn't escaped unharmed. Inside the cockpit, A faint burning smell hung in the air. Warnings still blinked across the flight panel. Hydraulic pressure low, engine 2 offline, and electrical circuits rerouted manually. The plane was flying, but barely. Mark exhaled shakily. "We should be celebrating, but—" Alyssa nodded. "But something doesn't feel right." She scanned the readings again. "Fuel burn rate is higher than normal, much higher. We must have ruptured a line during the storm." Mark's eyes widened. "You mean we're leaking fuel?" "Most likely. Estimate endurance. What have we got?" "Maybe 2 hours at best." Alyssa leaned back, staring into the endless dark ocean below.
2 hours, and that wasn't much.
London was out of reach now. They needed a new plan. "Nearest diversion field?" she asked. Mark checked the system map. "We can reach Shannon or maybe Halifax, but that's tight with one engine. Gander's closest, about 400 miles. "Gander it is," Alyssa said decisively. "We're not gambling tonight." She keyed the radio. "Gander Control, Flight 227. We're declaring fuel emergency. One engine down. Request immediate descent and vector for diversion." Static, then a reply crackled through. "Flight 227, roger. You are cleared direct to Gander International. Expect runway 04, weather improving. Emergency services will be standing by." Alyssa looked at Mark. "Let's bring her home." As the aircraft began its slow descent, the cabin lights dimmed again. Power conservation mode. The passengers were quiet now, exhausted and pale. Some clutched each other's hands, others silently cried. Flight attendant Sarah walked slowly down the aisle, checking seatbelts. She paused beside a little girl, the same one who had cried earlier, now asleep on her mother's lap. Sarah smiled faintly. "We're almost safe," she whispered. Back in the cockpit, Alyssa switched to manual landing prep. "We'll have limited hydraulics on approach, so we'll need a soft touch." Mark nodded. "Gear might be sluggish, too." "We'll manage," she said. "We always do." Minutes turned into an hour. Outside, the clouds began to thin. The faint glow of dawn touched the horizon, a gentle orange rim above the endless Atlantic. Alyssa exhaled. "First light. That's a good sign." But as she spoke, a new alarm pierced the calm. Fuel imbalance. Mark quickly checked the gauges. "Right tank dropping fast. We're losing pressure." Alyssa cursed under her breath. "Crossfeed system's failing. Shut the line manually before it drains completely." He reached for the valve switch, but it jammed. "Unresponsive." "Then we'll do it old school." She unbuckled her harness slightly and reached down beneath the console, pulling open a maintenance latch. A blast of cold air hissed through as she manually twisted the backup valve with both hands. The alarm stopped. Mark stared at her. "How do you even remember where that valve is?" She gave a half smile. "Because I helped design this cockpit layout when I was still a test pilot." It was true. Before she became a captain, Alyssa had been part of the engineering team that tested early Boeing systems. She knew the aircraft like a heartbeat. The clock ticked. 1 hour left of fuel. Gander was still 200 miles away. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath them, silent and merciless. Alyssa tightened her grip on the controls. "We're going to make it." Mark glanced sideways. "And if we don't?" She smiled faintly. "Then we'll glide." "I've done it before," he chuckled nervously. "You say that too casually." "I learned a long time ago," she said softly, "that fear doesn't help the wings fly." As they approached the Newfoundland coast, the weather radar finally cleared. The sky turned soft gray-blue, and the rising sun glowed over the horizon. The first landmass came into view, jagged cliffs, dark pine forests, and the faint glimmer of lights from the town of Gander. Alyssa keyed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're beginning our descent into Gander. I want to thank you for your patience and trust. We've been through a long night, but I promise, the worst is behind us." Applause rippled through the cabin. Tears streamed down faces. In the cockpit, however, the real test was just beginning. "Hydraulic pressure's dropping again," Mark warned. "If we lose it completely, we won't have brakes or flaps." Alyssa didn't hesitate. "Switch to manual backup. We'll use gravity drop for gear," and differential thrust for slowing down. That's risky. So is flying through a storm on one engine, she said with a small grin. At 10,000 feet, the runway lights came into sight. Faint, distant, but real. Runways 04 in view, Mark said, relief flooding his tone. Alyssa smiled softly. Visual acquired. Begin final checklist. Then, as if fate wanted one last challenge, the left engine sputtered. Mark's eyes shot wide. No, not now. Flames flickered briefly from the intake, then died. The cockpit went eerily quiet except for the faint whistle of wind. Both engines offline, he whispered. Alyssa's eyes hardened. Then we glide. She switched to battery power, adjusting the pitch. The massive 787 became a silent giant, gliding gracefully toward the runway miles below. Speed 230 knots, altitude 6,000. We're still too high, Alyssa nodded. Deploy speed brakes manually. Angle down 5 degrees. We're going to float her in. The cabin was silent, passengers sensing something was different but not knowing what. The engines were gone, yet the plane still moved forward through the morning air, its wings cutting the sky with ghost-like smoothness. At 2,000 feet, the runway grew larger, close enough to see fire trucks waiting. Mark's voice trembled. We're at glide minimums. Alyssa's hands were steady. Not yet. Hold her steady. Trim, good. The ground rushed up. The first rays of sunlight hit the windshield, blinding, golden. Alyssa squinted, adjusted her angle, and then, gently, beautifully, the plane touched down. The landing gear screamed. Sparks flew as the tires met the tarmac. Alyssa deployed reverse thrust manually. Nothing. Then she feathered the flaps just enough to bleed speed. The plane slowed, rattled, and finally stopped. Silence. For 3 long seconds, no one moved. Then, the cabin erupted in cheers, sobs, and laughter. Mark leaned back, tears in his eyes. You just landed a 200-ton glider. Alyssa smiled softly. She just needed a little faith. Her voice broke over the radio. Gander Tower, Flight 227, we're down. Everyone's safe. And somewhere in that cockpit, amid blinking warning lights and fading alarms, a single woman closed her eyes, exhausted, trembling but grateful. Because sometimes, surviving the storm isn't about strength. It's about staying calm enough to see the light at the end. The dawn light spilled gently across the tarmac of Gander International Airport. Flight 227 sat silent, its fuselage battered by the storm, paint scorched near the right engine, and wings streaked with ice. The once roaring jet was now a quiet monument to survival. Inside, passengers clung to one another in disbelief. Some cried openly, others prayed in hushed whispers. For most, it was the first time they'd ever been that close to death, and the first time they'd seen a miracle so human. The cockpit door opened slowly. Captain Alyssa Hartman stepped out, her uniform soaked in sweat, her hair damp from the long, impossible night. Yet her eyes, those steady, unshaken eyes, still carried calm. A little girl, the same one who'd cried through the storm, looked up at her with trembling lips. "Did you save us?" she whispered. Alyssa knelt beside her and smiled softly. "No, sweetheart. We saved each other. You were brave too." That moment, simple, human, unspoken, said more than any speech ever could. On the tarmac, rescue vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Firefighters rushed to check for fuel leaks. Medics boarded to assist frightened passengers. And ground crews stared in awe at the woman who had brought down a powerless jet without a single life lost. "Captain Hartman," a ground officer called, jogging up to her. "We didn't think you were going to make it." Alyssa smiled faintly. Neither did I for a few minutes. She handed over her flight report calmly, her fingers still trembling slightly. 2 engine failures, total hydraulic loss on descent. Glide landing. Everyone accounted for. The officer shook his head, speechless. "You just made history." Hours later, inside Gander's quiet terminal, passengers sat wrapped in blankets, sipping hot coffee. The news had already started to spread. Reporters gathered at the windows, cameras flashing, words like miracle landing and hero pilot echoing across the screens. Alyssa, however, sat alone in a corner of the waiting lounge, her flight jacket draped over her lap. Her co-pilot, Mark, approached with 2 steaming cups. "You should be out there," he said, handing her one. "They're calling it the calmest miracle in aviation," she chuckled softly. "Calm? That's generous. I was terrified half the time." He shook his head. "You didn't show it. Not once." Alyssa looked out the window, where the sun now glowed over the damaged jet. "You can't fly through fear," she said. "You fly through focus. Fear's always there, but you can't let it take the controls." Mark sat beside her quietly. For a moment, they both watched the plane, the silent witness to everything they'd survived. Later that afternoon, officials from the airline and aviation authorities arrived. They wanted to hear every detail, how she'd managed to glide a Boeing 787 with no engines, how she'd stabilized it without full hydraulics, and how not a single passenger had been injured. Alyssa walked them through the flight, calm, precise and humble. One investigator, an older man with a gravelly voice, asked, "Captain Hartman, when you realized both engines were gone, what went through your mind?" She smiled faintly. "The truth? I thought, well, this is where training either saves us or buries us." He raised a brow. "And yet you sounded completely calm over radio." "That's because calm isn't something you fake," she replied quietly. "It's a decision. One you make every second you're responsible for lives." Her words silenced the room. That evening, as the passengers prepared to board connecting flights, a small crowd gathered around Alyssa. Many wanted to thank her personally, to touch the hand that had guided them through chaos. A young mother stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "My daughter keeps saying you're a superhero." Alyssa laughed softly. "Tell her I'm just a pilot who didn't give up." An elderly man shook her hand firmly. "In 40 years of flying, I've never seen courage like that. You didn't just save a plane, Captain. You saved faith." For the first time since the storm, Alyssa felt her chest tighten, not from fear, but from emotion. She had been trained to protect lives, to stay composed, to keep flying no matter what. But hearing those words, that was something no checklist had prepared her for. When she finally returned to her hotel room that night, exhaustion hit her like gravity. She sat on the edge of the bed, eyes heavy. On the nightstand lay a small note from her co-pilot. "Because of your calm, 185 people saw the sunrise today. Mark." Tears filled her eyes. Not because of pride, but because of gratitude. For the crew, the passengers, and the fragile miracle of survival. She opened the window blinds. The storm clouds had completely vanished, leaving a wide, peaceful sky filled with stars. For a moment, she simply breathed, deeply, quietly. Alyssa whispered to herself, "The storm's gone." Finally. Weeks later, aviation boards around the world studied the flight data. Engineers, pilots, and safety experts called it one of the most extraordinary recoveries in modern history. Simulators couldn't even replicate what she had done, gliding a 787 through engine loss, turbulence, and hydraulic failure without losing control. The press named her the woman who tamed the storm. Her calm voice from the cockpit recording, firm, unwavering, became part of aviation training for pilots across the world. But for Alyssa, none of it was about fame. In her mind, it was simple. She had a job to do, and she'd done it with every ounce of strength and serenity she had. One interview months later summed it all up. A reporter asked, "Captain Hartman, what was the secret? How did you stay calm when everything was falling apart?" Alyssa smiled. "You don't fight the storm. You guide through it, 1 second, 1 breath at a time. Calm doesn't stop chaos. It just helps you see the way out." Years later, the passengers of Flight 227 would still remember that night. Many wrote letters. Some visited her in person. And every time she met one of them, They all said the same thing. When we heard your voice, we knew we'd live. That, more than medals or news stories, became Alyssa's legacy. Not the woman who saved a plane, but the woman whose calm saved hope, in a world that often forgets how powerful peace can be. As she stood once again in a cockpit months later, the sun rising before another flight, Alyssa touched the controls gently and whispered to herself, "For every storm, there's always a sky waiting to clear. You just have to keep flying." And with that, Flight 227's story became more than aviation history. It became a lesson that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the calm that changes everything.